Preambles to change orders. Every change order begins with a story, and it's usually an explanation as to why the change order is needed. These are what I call the preambles. As it turns out, there's really only a small handful of them. So we're going to talk about the most common ones and deconstruct them in such a way that we understand the underlying cause. And then we'll talk about some proactive strategies to head them off. Mission in part 4, the type of change order is presents it's a legitimate change. The strategies we've change order claims and averted strategies are intended and so if there is one strategies that we've been reduce or avert the number of are all in back and don't accept response have reduced your over the tenant. At the time we bid this project, we didn't know about X. Fill in that blank with any number of things. The presentation of a change order on that basis implies one of two things. Either there was insufficient knowledge of the building conditions or the conditions under which the work must be performed, or there was some kind of gap in the design information that prevented the bidder from being able to close that gap and present a complete, unequivocal bid. The project management strategies that we've previously discussed should be highly effective in closing off both of those lanes of a change order request. In our segment on managing built-in costs, we urge the tenant to not accept responsibility for construction processes that are not part of the tenant's leasehold improvements. And if you can avoid cost responsibility for construction outside of the demised tenant space or that's strictly related to capital improvements, then you've also eliminated high beta risk territory for unknown conditions. Think about it. You've got a professional architect who specializes in restaurant design who's ready to anticipate almost any type of condition that could be encountered in the context of a demised tenant space. But that architect can't have any foreknowledge of the type of conditions you'll encounter when you start digging holes out in the asphalt or when you start welding steel into the roof structure to make it capable of supporting rooftop restaurant equipment. As to the construction that you should be responsible for, the leasehold improvements within the demised tenant space, in part 2 we talked about enhanced discovery techniques to make the building reveal its mysteries and give up its secrets. Now, when this information becomes available, the architect and the engineers need to make design modifications accordingly before the bidding documents are issued, and if the bidding documents have already been issued and results of discovery come to light during the pre-bid conference, then the architect needs to issue written addenda to clarify that work and to assign it to the contractor, including adding it to the responsibility matrix. We also talked about a strategy within the bidding requirements where you furnish a bid form to the general contractor with a line item where they attest to the fact that they visited the job site and reviewed all of the existing conditions, including the entire catalog of existing condition documents. And finally, we talked about a bidding process where the line item caveats are resolved one at a time until every matter that needs clarification is clarified and every cost factor is resolved to a stipulated sum. Now, if all of these project management strategies are followed, and there still emerges a change order request based on unknown conditions, then there's a very good probability that really is a change order based on undiscovered conditions that were recently encountered. In that case, the architect obviously needs to verify the change order, and if the architect represents to the owner that it's valid, then the owner should demonstrate goodwill and approve the change order without further question. but take comfort in the fact that you've exercised good project management strategies and undoubtedly filtered out lots of change orders that could have occurred. And realize that in some cases, concealed conditions are exactly that. Solely responsible in the stipulated sum. The they may make a profit, and in some categories, ability within the contract with no contract sum. Any point that the owner, in order to cover land, the best that I can offer to strategy to prevent the best strategy, basically the entire hearing contract. If they do so, contract, manage your curiosity. All of this procedure, a cost overrun inside contractor is stuck by their The next preamble that I want to discuss is one that's not terribly common, but there should be some strategies in place to prevent this. That is a contractor's statement that we can't build it the way the architect designed it because it won't meet code. Well, there's some good news and some bad news in there. And the good news is that the contractor and the subcontractors are conscientious, and they're not just going to go blindly follow plans that they believe are inaccurate. The bad news is that somewhere the communication systems aren't working properly, because this type of a claim should never be escalated to the level of a change order request until after it's been discussed and reviewed with the architect. And in fact, an architect will always just about drop whatever they're doing when there's a claim coming from the field that something they've designed doesn't meet code. It will be escalated to their highest level of concern that day. When the communications are reestablished and then the architect is given the opportunity to review the details of the claim, it may be true or it may not be true. There are lots of cases where people in the field are working off the basis of code analogy rather than code analysis. There's a project I know of a few years ago where a framing contractor claimed that they needed a change order because the architect had specified 5/8 inch conventional plywood for backing behind some wood paneling in the dining room. Well, when I dug into it a little further, I found out that the basis for this claim was the subcontractor had built 3 other similar projects the year before, and in each case, the framing inspector told them that they had to use 5/8 inch fire retardant treated plywood. Well, as it turns out, those were all projects in a much larger building, something that was classified as a Type 2 construction, which is entirely non-combustible. And the project we were working on was a small building with Type 5B construction, where combustible framing is permitted. So it was really just a miscommunication, or it was a case of code analogy rather than code analysis. Now, there are other cases where the subcontractor will be confronted by an actual building inspector who says that whatever it is that's on the plans doesn't meet code. That's also a case where the architect should receive a phone call immediately. Sometimes the building inspector is right, and sometimes the building inspector doesn't realize the full context of the detail. And I've had many opportunities to calmly discuss my code intent with a building inspector, perhaps when they're back at the office and have a chance to look at their code books. And most of the time, quite honestly, after some discussion, the building inspector will realize the path of code analysis that I've taken and will agree with it. But that won't happen if the subcontractor just immediately reacts to the claim of the building inspector that something has to be done a certain way. Most of the time that just gets done, and then the owner is presented with a change order after the fact. The cure to all of this is constant communications across the entire project team that consists of the owner, the general contractor, and the architect. Now, if it's not practical to have a job site meeting every week, at the very least there should be a telephone conference every week between those 3 parties. And this is where all of these types of discussions can get worked out in a proper fashion before any of this gets escalated to a change order. It's of vital importance for the owner's benefit to keep the architect engaged in the construction process. Now, this is costly, and sometimes the owner doesn't like the idea of having to pay those fees. Sometimes the architect doesn't want to be bothered with the continual communication requirements for an ongoing project. Sometimes it's the general contractor who would just as soon not have the architect involved in the process, and they would rather be able to work out all of their questions directly with the owner. As a general rule, that is just not an acceptable project management approach. And the only time that would be acceptable is in a design-build context where the general contractor really is negotiating design decisions with the owner, because value engineering is the most important thing, and design intent, it can be flexible. I don't know any restaurant project where that can hold true. The architect has to play a vital role to represent the owner's interests, and the drawings have to be the standard by which decisions are made in the field unless the architect alters those drawings. Constant, reliable, and intentional communications are the right answer. There's one final preamble that I want to discuss, and it's important even though the sword swings the other way on this one. And that is the explanation that we can't build it according to the way the architect drew it because the drawings are wrong. Or a similar one, we can't build it the way the architect drew it because the drawings are incomplete. Well, that's no shock to me, and no doubt it's no shock to anyone else. In fact, if a general contractor had prepared this presentation, that preamble would be right at the top of the list. When the situation does occur that there are technical defects in the drawings and the contractor will need a change order to achieve correction, the owner needs to be careful to issue a measured response. Chances are it's really a defect in a limited area, and it's not the whole set of drawings that are declared to be inaccurate or incomplete. And if the architect has verified that the change order is authorized because the drawings have to be changed to correct the problem, then the owner needs to go ahead and make a payment on the change order as an expression of good faith. And also that owner should uphold their trust in the credibility of the architect and in the position of those drawings as being the standard for which all construction will be carried out. In a football game, if a defensive coordinator perceives that there's a weak place in the offensive line, they're going to attack that spot again and again, and the quarterback can expect nothing but ongoing pass rushing from that lane. Well, I've made a sports analogy, and I, of all people, should never do that. But the point is, weakness will always be exploited. And that's true even in the context of friendly business where goodwill prevails. This is just the way business is. If the general perception of weakness is allowed to prevail, then from that point on, every gray area in the drawings will be presented to the owner as an error that requires a change order. It's vitally important to the owner that the architect maintain credibility and that the drawings continue to be the standard for all work throughout the duration of the project. Now, the question that we should be addressing is, in a proactive way, how can the owner prevent this sort of thing from happening? And the answer is, the owner must carefully select an architect that has the competence, the experience, and the character to represent the owner throughout the entire process. In just the same way that contractors are first pre-qualified before they are invited to submit a bid, the owner should review qualification statements from architects before beginning the selection process and should limit that to a number of architects that are qualified through years of experience and dozens, if not hundreds, of successful restaurant designs. The skills of the architect need to be proven not only as a designer, but also as an effective project manager who can carry out the bidding process and the construction administration process rigorously throughout the entire project. I realize that price and availability are also important aspects of the architect selection process. And as to availability, you definitely want to make sure the architect has capacity in their schedule to handle your project. And with regard to price, competitiveness is important, but everyone knows that you get what you pay for. What not so many people realize is the most costly architect might be the one that comes with the lowest fee. That's a wrap on our 4-part series on cost control beyond design. I hope you find these strategies interesting and challenging and a break from conventional thinking. I'm confident of this. If you'll put these strategies into practice, you'll realize a significant reduction in cost overruns in the field. I look forward to another opportunity to be with you as we continue to develop high-level videos on restaurant design. Thanks for being with me.